The biting winds of the Whitner Mountains hold a chilling secret. Deep within the 14th century archives of Ethelgard lies the forgotten account of King Cedric Montgomery. Legend dictates he was a ruthless warlord, but the truth is far more gripping. What transpires when a merciless Alpha King stumbles upon a banished snow-white Omega and her 6 freezing pups on the brink of death? The answer sparked the bloodiest war of the century. Tell me who did this. I'll end them all. The winter of 1342 was recorded in the historical archives of Ethelgard as the White Death. Blizzards ravaged the northern territories for months without reprieve, burying entire villages beneath insurmountable drifts of ice and snow. In the heart of this frozen wasteland stood King Cedric Montgomery, the formidable alpha of the Iron Fang pack. Cedric was a man carved from the very granite of his kingdom, unforgiving, battle-scarred, and feared by allies and enemies alike. His reign had brought unprecedented stability to the violent medieval territories, but it came at the cost of his own humanity. He was a king without a queen, an alpha without a mate, leading a pack that respected his immense power but feared his volatile wrath. On the eve of the winter solstice, Cedric rode out on a routine border patrol along the treacherous ridges of the Whitner Mountains. Accompanied by his most trusted commander, Garrett Fitzroy, and a dozen elite guards, the king sought to intercept any rogue packs attempting to cross into his lands, seeking refuge from the lethal storms. The wind howled like a wounded beast, whipping crystalline snow against their thick, dire wolf pelt cloaks. The temperature had plummeted so drastically that even the elevated internal body heat of the lycanthropes was struggling to keep the deadly frost at bay. It was Garrett who signaled the halt. He raised a heavy, gauntleted hand, his steely eyes scanning the blinding white expanse. Cedric pulled back on the reins of his massive war horse, his own heightened senses flaring to life. Beneath the overwhelming scent of pine, ozone, and freezing earth, there was something else. It was incredibly faint, nearly erased by the gale-force winds, but unmistakable to an alpha of his lineage: vanilla, crushed lavender, and the sharp metallic tang of fresh blood. Cedric dismounted with a heavy thud, his boots sinking deep into the snow. He did not issue a command. His men knew better than to speak when the king was tracking. He followed the scent, letting his primal instincts take over. The trail led away from the safety of the mountain pass and down into a jagged ravine, a treacherous area known for lethal avalanches and hidden crevasses. The wind roared louder here, funneling through the narrow rock faces, but the scent grew stronger. It was laced with an overwhelming, suffocating aura of despair and distress. At the base of an ancient, hollowed-out oak tree, half buried under a massive snowdrift, Cedric found the source. At first glance, he thought it was merely a pile of discarded white furs left to rot in the wilderness. But as he stepped closer, the snow shifted. A faint, rattling breath breached the silence of the ravine. Cedric dropped to one knee, his large hands carefully sweeping away the thick layer of ice and snow. What he uncovered made the breath catch in his throat, a rare occurrence for a warlord who had witnessed the most gruesome battlefields of his era. Curled in a desperate, shivering ball was a woman. Her skin was as pale as the snow surrounding her, her hair a startling, pure white that blended seamlessly with the frost. Her eyelashes were coated in ice, and her lips were tinged with a deadly blue. But it was not just her albinism that shocked the Alpha King. It was the undeniable, sweet scent radiating from her fragile form. She was an Omega. In the brutal hierarchy of the 14th century lycanthrope world, omegas were treasured, protected above all else for their rarity and their calming presence. To find one discarded in the wilderness during the White Death was not just an anomaly, it was a heinous crime. But the horror did not end there. As Cedric reached out to check her pulse, the omega shifted weakly, a low guttural growl vibrating in her chest. Even on the precipice of death, her maternal instincts demanded she protect what lay beneath her. Tucked desperately against her freezing abdomen, shielded by the remnants of her shredded blood-stained gown, were 6 tiny bundles. Pups. They were impossibly small, their eyes still sealed shut, their tiny bodies shivering violently in the sub-zero temperatures. "Garrett!" Cedric roared over the howling wind, his voice cracking with a mixture of disbelief and sudden, explosive rage. The commander scrambled down the embankment, followed closely by the rest of the guard. When Garrett's eyes fell upon the hollowed tree, the seasoned warrior staggered back, the color draining from his weathered face. "By the gods," Garrett whispered, crossing himself. "An omega, and her litter, left to freeze." Cedric did not waste another second. He stripped off his massive direwolf cloak, the heavy fur retaining the intense heat of his alpha blood. He wrapped it entirely around the frail omega and her 6 pups, scooping them into his arms with a surprising, almost reverent gentleness. The omega weighed practically nothing, her bones protruding against Cedric's armor. As he lifted her, her crystalline eyes fluttered open for a fraction of a second. They were a striking, ethereal shade of violet, filled with such profound terror and agony that it pierced straight through the king's hardened heart. "Safe," Cedric rumbled, his voice dropping into the resonant, commanding frequency of his wolf. It was a sound meant to soothe, an alpha's ultimate promise of sanctuary. Her head lolled against his chest, her consciousness fading. Cedric looked down at the 6 pups. 3 of them had stopped shivering, their tiny breaths coming in shallow, erratic gasps. Frostbite had already begun to claim their extremities. The sheer cruelty of the scene ignited a fire within Cedric's veins, a roaring inferno of protective instinct that he had never experienced in his 30 years of life. He turned back to his men, his eyes bleeding from their natural amber to a terrifying glowing crimson. The Alpha King's aura exploded outward, a crushing wave of dominance and fury that forced every single guard to drop to their knees in the snow. "We ride for Castle Dunbarton immediately," Cedric commanded, his voice echoing off the ravine walls with lethal promise. He looked down at the violently trembling omega in his arms, his jaw set like stone. "Tell me who did this," he whispered into the frozen wind, knowing she could not hear him. "I'll end them all." The ride back to Castle Dunbarton was a frantic blur of snow, tearing hooves and desperate prayers. King Cedric Montgomery rode like a man possessed by demons, pushing his massive warhorse to the absolute limits of its endurance. Beneath his heavy armor, he pressed the fragile omega and her 6 pups firmly against his chest, using his immense alpha body heat to combat the creeping grip of death. Garrett and the guards flanked him, forming a tight wedge to break the harsh mountain winds, their faces grim and set. When the towering stone spires of Castle Dunbarton finally pierced the blinding blizzard, Cedric did not wait for the massive iron portcullis to be fully raised. He spurred his horse through the narrow gap, the animal's hooves sparking violently against the cobblestone courtyard. "Summon Beatrice!" Cedric's roar shattered the quiet routine of the fortress. Get the healer now. Bring boiling water, heated stones, and every fur in the east wing." The courtyard erupted into organized chaos. Servants scrambled, dropping whatever they were doing to obey the Alpha King's thunderous commands. Cedric vaulted from his horse, refusing to relinquish his precious cargo to anyone. He carried the Omega through the great hall, ignoring the gasps of the gathered courtiers who stared in shock at the sight of their ruthless monarch cradling a bloodied snow-white woman. He kicked open the heavy oak doors to his own private chambers, bypassing the guest quarters entirely. He laid her gently upon the massive, velvet-draped canopy bed, pulling back his cloak to assess the damage in the warm light of the hearth. Beatrice, a stern, older woman who had served as the pack's primary healer for 4 decades, rushed into the room carrying a satchel of medieval remedies. Her eyes widened at the sight of the albino Omega and the 6 tiny blue-tinged pups. "Out, my king," Beatrice commanded, completely ignoring protocol as she threw her satchel onto the heavy wooden table. "Your presence will overwhelm her if she wakes. Let me work." For a moment, Cedric's crimson eyes flashed with territorial defiance, a primal urge to guard what he had claimed from the snow. But reason prevailed. He took a heavy step back, his hands stained with the Omega's frozen blood. "Save them, Beatrice," he warned, his voice a low, vibrating threat. "Save all of them, or I will burn this kingdom to the ground looking for someone to blame." For the next 8 hours, Cedric paced the stone corridors outside his chambers like a caged beast. The castle was suffocatingly tense. The historical ledgers of the Ironfang pack would later record this night as the turning point of Cedric's reign. Inside the room, Beatrice utilized every ounce of her medical knowledge. She packed the pups in warm sheep's wool, rubbing their tiny limbs with a salve of wolfsbane and camphor to stimulate blood flow. She forced a broth of bone marrow and raw venison past the Omega's pale lips, desperate to raise her internal temperature and provide sustenance for her failing body. It was nearly dawn when the heavy oak doors finally creaked open. Beatrice emerged, her apron stained and her face lined with exhaustion. "Well?" Cedric demanded, closing the distance between them in a single stride. "She will live," Beatrice sighed, wiping a hand across her brow. The frostbite was severe, but Omegas have a resilient healing factor when placed in a safe environment. She is severely malnourished. She has been running for weeks, my king, starving herself so her body could produce enough milk to keep the litter alive." "And the pups?" Cedric asked, his chest tight. "5 will survive without complication," Beatrice said softly. "The 6th, the smallest female. Her lungs were badly damaged by the cold. It will be a fight, but she breathes." Cedric let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He pushed past the healer, stepping quietly into the dimly lit chamber. The fire was roaring in the massive hearth, casting dancing shadows across the tapestries. The Omega was propped up against a mountain of down pillows. The dirt and blood had been washed away, revealing her striking, otherworldly beauty. Her snow-white hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her pale skin seemed to glow in the firelight. As Cedric approached, her violet eyes snapped open. The sheer panic in her gaze was instantaneous. She scrambled backward against the headboard, a weak, raspy hiss escaping her throat as she threw her arms over the basket where her pups lay sleeping near the fire. "Peace," Cedric murmured, immediately dropping to one knee beside the bed to lower his intimidating height. He kept his hands visible, palms open. You are safe. You are in Castle Dunbarton. I am King Cedric Montgomery." The Omega trembled violently, her wide eyes darting around the opulent room before settling back on the giant, battle-scarred man kneeling before her. "Why?" she croaked, her voice hoarse from the cold and disuse. "Why did you save us?" "Because you were dying in my territory," Cedric answered simply, his amber eyes locked onto hers. "What is your name, Omega?" She hesitated, her breathing shallow. "Genevieve," she whispered. "Genevieve Sinclair." The name sent a shock wave through Cedric's mind. The Sinclair bloodline was an ancient, aristocratic family from the Southern Territories, lands controlled by his greatest political rival, the Beaufort clan. "Genevieve," Cedric repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It suited her. "You are far from the southern valleys. A mother does not drag a newborn litter of 6 into the Whitner Mountains during the White Death unless she is being hunted. Who did this to you?" Genevieve squeezed her eyes shut, a solitary tear escaping and tracking down her pale cheek. The memory seemed to physically pain her. He cast us out. When the pups were born, when he saw my white hair and realized the pups carried the same curse, he called us an abomination. He ordered his guards to drag us into the snow to die so his reputation would remain untarnished. Cedric's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ground together. "Who?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. Genevieve looked at him, her violet eyes swimming with a mixture of immense grief and burning hatred. "My mate," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Lord Reginald Beaufort." The air in the room seemed to freeze all over again. Lord Reginald Beaufort, the powerful Duke of the Southern Reaches, the man Cedric had signed a fragile peace treaty with less than 6 months ago, the man who had just sentenced an innocent Omega and his own flesh and blood to a freezing, agonizing death. Cedric stood slowly, his massive frame casting a long, dark shadow over the room. The vow he had made in the snowstorm echoed in his mind. "Rest, Genevieve," Cedric said, his tone devoid of all emotion, masking the monstrous, violent storm brewing within him. "Nobody will ever harm you or these pups again." He turned toward the door, his eyes flashing a brilliant, terrifying crimson in the firelight. "Garrett," he roared as he stepped into the hall, "summon the generals. We march on the southern reaches at dawn." Dawn broke over Castle Dunbarton, not with the gentle light of morning, but with the harsh, metallic clang of a kingdom preparing for total war. The blizzard that had ravaged the Whitner Mountains was finally beginning to break, leaving behind a frozen, crystalline world that mirrored the absolute coldness in King Cedric Montgomery's heart. In the cavernous war room of the fortress, the Alpha King stood over a massive oak table, his large hands planted firmly on a sprawling parchment map of the realm. The flickering torches cast long, imposing shadows against the stone walls, reflecting the grim determination etched onto the faces of his most trusted commanders. General Alistair Kensington, a veteran of 100 brutal border skirmishes, traced a calloused finger along the southern trade routes. "My king," Alistair began, his voice thick with apprehension. "A direct march on the southern reaches is a logistical nightmare in this snow. Furthermore, we signed the Treaty of the Silver Crescent with Lord Reginald Beaufort only 6 months ago. If we cross the border with a mobilized army, the High Council of Alphas will view it as an unprovoked act of treason. We will lose all political backing. Political backing? Cedric growled, the sound vibrating low and dangerous in his chest. His amber eyes flickered with the terrifying crimson light of his inner beast. Reginald Beaufort abandoned his own mate and a litter of newborn pups to freeze to death in a ravine. He dumped them in my territory. The treaty was broken the moment his filthy boots crossed my borders to dispose of his bloodline. There is no treaty with a monster, Alistair. There is only execution. Commander Garrett Fitzroy stepped forward, his hand resting heavily on the pommel of his broadsword. The vanguard is ready, sire. 3,000 of our strongest wolves. We carry enough salted meats and hardtack to sustain the march, but we must move fast before Beaufort's spies alert him to our mobilization. Cedric nodded sharply. We ride in human form until we hit the crossing at the Whispering Pines. Then we shift and run. I want the castle surrounded before Reginald even finishes his evening wine. No mercy for his soldiers. We tear down the gates and we drag him out by his throat. While the drums of war echoed through the castle courtyards, a profoundly different atmosphere settled over the Alpha King's private chambers. Genevieve Sinclair awoke slowly, her senses overwhelmed by the intense radiant heat of the roaring hearth and the heavy scent of pine and leather that clung to the bed linens. For a terrifying, fleeting moment, she thought she was back in the snow, hallucinating the warmth as death finally claimed her. But as her violet eyes fluttered open, she saw the grand tapestries of the Iron Fang Pack and the soft glow of the morning sun filtering through the stained glass windows. Panic seized her chest. She bolted upright, ignoring the agonizing, burning pain in her frostbitten limbs. "My pups!" she gasped, her voice raw. "They are right here, child," a soothing voice commanded. Beatrice, the seasoned healer, stepped into Genevieve's line of sight. She carried a woven willow basket lined with the thickest, softest sheep's wool. Inside, 5 tiny snow-white pups were wriggling blindly against one another, their breathing steady and their bodies warm. Genevieve let out a choked sob, reaching out with trembling, bandaged hands to pull the basket against her chest. She buried her face in their soft fur, inhaling their milky scent. But the relief was violently interrupted. "Wait," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "There are only 5. Where is the smallest? Where is my little girl?" Beatrice offered a sad, weary smile and pointed toward the hearth. Nestled inside a hollowed-out stone basin filled with heated sand and wrapped tightly in a swaddle of velvet, the 6th pup lay isolated. Her lungs took the brunt of the cold air, Genevieve. She is too weak to fight her siblings for milk right now. I have been feeding her drops of goat's milk mixed with healing herbs every hour. She is a fighter, just like her mother, but she needs time. Tears streamed down Genevieve's pale cheeks. She looked around the opulent room, the reality of her situation slowly sinking in. "The king, King Cedric, where is he? I must thank him. He saved us from the White Death." Beatrice paused, her hands pausing as she ground a mortar and pestle. She looked at the albino Omega, her expression filled with a mixture of pity and deep respect. "The king is not here, Genevieve. He rode out an hour ago with 3,000 warriors." "Rode out?" Genevieve echoed, her heart plummeting. "To where?" "To the southern reaches," Beatrice replied softly, the weight of the words hanging heavy in the warm air. "He has gone to war for you. He swore to bring you the head of Lord Reginald Beaufort for what he did to your family." Genevieve slumped back against the down pillows, completely stunned. In the brutal, patriarchal society of the 14th century lycanthropes, omegas were treated as prizes to be claimed, or in her case, discarded if deemed defective. No alpha went to war for a banished, broken omega. Yet King Cedric Montgomery, the most feared warlord of the Northern Territories, was currently marching an army through a blizzard to avenge a woman he had only just met. It was an unprecedented act of savagery and honor, and as Genevieve clutched her pups to her chest, a profound, undeniable bond began to tether her soul to the ruthless Alpha King. The southern reaches enjoyed a significantly milder winter than the unforgiving Northern Territories. The snow here was little more than a dusting over the sprawling fertile valleys that Lord Reginald Beaufort proudly called his own. Castle Highmount sat atop a sheer cliff, its massive limestone walls projecting an aura of impenetrable arrogance. Inside the great hall, Lord Reginald was indulging in a lavish feast, surrounded by his sycophantic courtiers and a new, politically advantageous concubine. He was a handsome man by conventional standards, but his eyes held a cruel, calculating emptiness. In his mind, the problem of his albino mate and her cursed, freakish litter had been cleanly resolved by the White Death. His reputation as a genetically flawless alpha was secure. He was in the middle of raising a silver goblet of imported wine when the heavy oak doors of the great hall violently burst open. A bloodied sentry collapsed onto the stone floor, an iron fang arrow protruding from his shoulder. "My lord!" the sentry choked out, gasping for air. "The North! The North has come!" Before Reginald could even process the warning, the haunting, bone-chilling blare of war horns shattered the evening sky. It was not a single horn, but a cacophony of deep, resonant blasts that signaled a massive, coordinated assault. Reginald dropped his goblet, the dark wine spilling across the floor like blood, and sprinted up the winding stone stairs to the battlements. When he looked down into the valley, the breath was completely robbed from his lungs. Surrounding Castle Highmount was an ocean of colossal, snarling, dire wolves. The Iron Fang vanguard had arrived. At the forefront of the massive army stood King Cedric Montgomery. He had not shifted. He stood tall in his heavy black iron battle armor, a massive broadsword resting effortlessly on his shoulder. His crimson eyes glowed in the fading twilight, burning with a demonic hatred that seemed to scorch the very air between them. "Cedric!" Reginald shouted over the battlements, trying desperately to mask the sheer terror trembling in his voice. "What is the meaning of this? We have a treaty. You march an army to my gates without provocation? The High Council will strip you of your crown." Cedric's voice carried over the wind, magnified by the supernatural power of his alpha aura. It hit their castle walls like a physical blow. "A treaty is a promise between honorable men, Beaufort. I make no promises to cowards who leave newborn pups to freeze in the snow." Reginald's face drained of all color. He knows, he realized with sickening clarity. The Omega survived. "She was an abomination!" Reginald screamed defensively, his panic making him reckless. "A white-haired freak. The pups were tainted. It was my right as an alpha to cleanse my bloodline." Cedric didn't bother to argue. He simply raised his broadsword and pointed the blood-grooved tip directly at Reginald's chest. "Break the gates," Cedric commanded softly. The order rippled through the vanguard. 3,000 dire wolves howled in unison, a sound so terrifying that several of Reginald's guards abandoned their posts and fled into the castle depths. The siege was brutal, brief, and entirely one-sided. The Iron Fang warriors moved with a synchronized, lethal efficiency that Beaufort's pampered soldiers could not possibly hope to match. Battering rams splintered the iron-reinforced wood of the main gates within minutes. Carnage spilled into the courtyards. Cedric waded through the chaos like a god of war, his broadsword cleaving through armor and bone with terrifying ease. He did not bother to shift into his wolf form. He wanted Reginald to see the face of the man who was destroying his empire. Blood soaked the snow as the Iron Fang guards secured the perimeter, trapping Reginald inside his own fortress. Cedric kicked open the doors to the throne room, the heavy hinges screaming in protest. Reginald was cowering behind his gilded throne, clutching a decorative dagger in a pathetic display of defense. "Stay back!" Reginald shrieked, blindly thrusting the blade. Cedric caught the man's wrist, applying just enough pressure to shatter the bone. Reginald howled in agony, dropping the dagger as he fell to his knees. Cedric grabbed the treacherous Alpha by the throat, hoisting him off the floor until his feet dangled in the air. "Tell me," Cedric whispered, his voice a lethal, rumbling thunder. "Why did you really cast her out? Do not lie to me about the color of her hair. Omegas are too rare, too precious. Even a cruel man would sell her, not kill her. What are you hiding?" Reginald clawed desperately at Cedric's iron grip, his face turning a mottled purple. "The prophecy!" he gasped, spitting blood onto Cedric's breastplate. "She is not just an Omega. The white hair, the violet eyes. She is a Sinclair, but she carries the blood of the lunar oracles." Cedric's eyes narrowed. The lunar oracles were a myth, a bedtime story told to pups about ancient seers who could communicate directly with the moon goddess, wielding magic that could subjugate even the strongest alphas. "The texts, hidden in my archives," Reginald choked out, tears of pain and terror streaming down his face. "The prophecy states that an albino oracle will birth a litter of 6. One of those pups, is destined to overthrow the ruling caste. They will destroy the alpha hierarchy forever. I had to kill them. I had to protect our way of life." Cedric stared at the pathetic, sniveling lord. The revelation was staggering, shifting the entire political landscape of their world. Genevieve was not just a discarded mate. She was the mother of a revolution. And Reginald had tried to murder her out of pure, cowardly self-preservation. "You sought to protect your crown by murdering infants in the snow," Cedric said, his voice entirely devoid of mercy. "You are no alpha." With a swift, brutal motion, Cedric tightened his grip, ending the Duke of the Southern Reaches. He dropped the lifeless body onto the cold stone floor, the sound echoing loudly in the silent throne room. The war for vengeance had been won, but as Cedric looked down at the dead man, he realized the war for survival had only just begun. The High Council would hunt Genevieve and her pups to the ends of the earth if the prophecy were true. King Cedric Montgomery wiped the blood from his gauntlet, his jaw setting into a rigid line. He would protect his new Omega and her extraordinary pups, even if he had to burn the rest of the world to ash to do it. The journey back to Castle Dunbarton was infinitely slower than the violent, frantic march to the southern reaches. King Cedric Montgomery rode at the head of the Iron Fang vanguard, the severed banner of the Beaufort clan dragged through the mud beneath his destrier's hooves. The White Death had finally broken, leaving behind a painfully bright, sunlit world of melting ice and overflowing rivers. Yet, the warmth of the sun did nothing to thaw the chilling revelation that echoed in Cedric's mind. The lunar oracles. It was a phrase that belonged in dusty, forgotten tomes, not in the brutal, pragmatic reality of his kingdom. When the massive iron portcullis of Dunbarton was finally raised to welcome the victorious king, Cedric did not stop to address the cheering crowds in the courtyard. He handed his reins to a stable boy, bypassed his commanders, and strode directly through the great hall. His armor was still caked in dried blood and the ash of the southern reaches, but he did not care. He pushed open the heavy oak doors to his private chambers, the heavy scent of pine and crushed lavender immediately washing over him, calming the agitated beast raging beneath his skin. Genevieve was sitting by the hearth, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon sun. She looked healthier. The deadly blue tinge had entirely vanished from her lips, replaced by a soft, natural rose. Her snow-white hair had been braided intricately by the castle maids, weaving small silver beads into the thick locks. She was nursing 3 of the pups, her expression one of profound maternal peace. However, as Cedric stepped fully into the room, the heavy clanking of his armor caused her to flinch. Her violet eyes darted toward him, widening slightly at the sight of the blood staining his black iron breastplate. "Beaufort is dead," Cedric announced, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He unfastened his heavy gauntlets, dropping them onto the wooden table with a loud clatter. "His fortress is dismantled. His armies are scattered. He will never hunt you again, Genevieve." Genevieve exhaled a long, trembling breath. She gently placed the sleeping pups back into their willow basket, pulling the velvet bodice of her borrowed gown tightly around her chest. "You went to war for me, for a broken omega you found in the snow." Her voice was a mixture of awe and deep-seated fear. "Why, Cedric? You have risked the wrath of the High Council. You have invited a political cataclysm. I am the Alpha of the Iron Fang," Cedric replied, stepping closer to the hearth. The sheer physical presence of the man seemed to consume the oxygen in the room. "I do not fear the High Council, but I do demand the truth from those under my protection." He stopped just a few feet away from her, his amber eyes locking onto her striking violet gaze. "Before I crushed the life from his throat, Reginald Beaufort claimed you were not just an anomaly. He spoke of a prophecy. He claimed you carry the bloodline of the lunar oracles." The color rapidly drained from Genevieve's face, leaving her as pale as the snow she had nearly died in. She instinctively backed away, her hands hovering protectively over the basket of pups. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the bedchamber was the crackling of the fire and the soft whimpering of the isolated 6th pup in the heated stone basin. "He found the journals," Genevieve whispered, her voice cracking. "The hidden diaries of Lady Catherine Seymour, my great-grandmother. She was the last recorded oracle, hidden away in a remote convent to escape the purges of the 12th century. Our family buried the truth. We married into aristocratic bloodlines, diluting the magic, hoping the curse would fade. But it did not fade. It simply lay dormant." Cedric's jaw tightened. "So, the myth is real. The oracles exist." Genevieve nodded slowly, tears brimming in her eyes. "We do not just give life, Cedric. The blood of the oracle allows an omega to channel the raw, primordial energy of the moon itself. But the power comes at a terrible cost. It requires a catalyst. It requires a child of pure lineage. She turned her gaze toward the small stone basin near the fire. When my pups were born, Reginald demanded to see them. 5 of them were normal, healthy wolves. But the 6th, the smallest female, Cedric followed her gaze. He stepped past Genevieve, crouching down beside the heated basin. The 6th pup, the one Beatrice had fought so desperately to keep alive, was awake. She was no larger than Cedric's palm, a fragile creature of white fur and fragile bones. But as the Alpha King looked down, the pup opened her eyes. Cedric's breath hitched. The pup's eyes were not the blind, milky blue of a newborn wolf. They were a brilliant, glowing silver. It was a light so pure and ancient that it made Cedric's own alpha aura instinctively recoil. As he reached out a massive, scarred finger, the tiny pup nuzzled against it. Instantly, a shockwave of cold, ethereal energy surged up Cedric's arm, not a painful frostbite, but a soothing, unnatural chill that instantly quelled the residual battle rage boiling in his blood. "She is the one the prophecy spoke of," Genevieve said softly, kneeling beside Cedric. "The oracle pup destined to shatter the absolute rule of the alphas." Reginald saw her eyes. He knew what she was. He could not bring himself to slit her throat with his own hands, so he banished us to the Whitner Mountains, trusting the White Death to do his cowardly work. Cedric stared at the glowing silver eyes of the tiny creature holding on to his finger. In the medieval lycanthrope society, power was dictated by brute strength, dominance, and violence. A creature capable of wielding ancient magic was a threat to the very foundation of their world. The High Council would burn Dunbarton to the ground to eradicate this pup. "She is magnificent," Cedric murmured, his voice entirely devoid of fear. He looked up at Genevieve, the crimson light of his wolf flashing briefly in his amber eyes. "Her name, what did you name her?" "Aurelia," Genevieve whispered, trembling as the Alpha King gently scooped the fragile, glowing pup into his massive hands. "Aurelia," Cedric repeated, standing up to his full, towering height. He brought the pup to his chest, shielding her radiant eyes from the rest of the room. "The council will come for her, Genevieve. They will come for all of you. But they will find an Iron Fang wall standing in their way. From this day forward, you are no longer a Sinclair, and you are no longer a Beaufort." Cedric reached out, his blood-stained fingers gently brushing a stray lock of white hair from Genevieve's cheek. "You are mine, and I protect what is mine." 3 weeks passed since the fall of Castle Highmount. The snows of the Whitner Mountains had completely melted, turning the rugged landscape into a vibrant emerald expanse. However, a different kind of storm was brewing outside the walls of Castle Dunbarton. The High Council of Alphas, the supreme governing body of the lycanthrope territories, had finally reacted to King Cedric Montgomery's unprecedented act of war. A massive pavilion of crimson and gold silk had been erected just beyond the fortress's drawbridge. Surrounded by 500 heavily armored elite paladins, Lord Harrison Cromwell, the cruel and calculating Prime Minister of the High Council, awaited an audience. Beside him stood Inquisitor Gideon Rothcroft, a man infamous across the realm for his ruthless interrogations and fanatical devotion to the purity of the Alpha hierarchy. They had not come to negotiate. They had come to dictate terms. Inside the great hall of Dunbarton, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Cedric sat upon his massive iron-forged throne. His commanders flanked around him like statues of lethal intent. He wore a ceremonial tunic of dark velvet and silver mail, his crown of twisted black iron resting heavily upon his brow. He looked every inch the formidable warlord the realm feared. "Let them in," Cedric commanded, his voice echoing off the vaulted stone ceilings. The heavy doors groaned open. Lord Cromwell strode into the hall with an air of unbearable arrogance, his velvet cape sweeping across the floor. Inquisitor Rothcroft followed closely behind, his sharp, predatory eyes scanning the shadows of the room. They stopped precisely 10 paces from the throne, neither man bowing to the Northern King. "King Cedric Montgomery," Cromwell began, his voice dripping with condescension, "you have committed an act of high treason. The unprovoked siege of the southern reaches and the murder of Lord Reginald Beaufort are crimes that threaten the stability of the entire realm. The council demands reparations, the immediate surrender of the southern territories, the disbandment of your vanguard, and most importantly, the execution of the abomination that sparked this madness." Cedric leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Reginald Beaufort broke the laws of nature. He abandoned an Omega and her pups to freeze. I merely delivered justice. Justice is not yours to deal outside your borders," Inquisitor Rothcroft snapped, stepping forward. He produced a rolled parchment stamped with the wax seal of the High Council. "Furthermore, our spies report that this Omega is not a mere victim. She is a Sinclair. She carries the tainted, heretical blood of the lunar oracles. She is a witch, Cedric, a dangerous relic of a forgotten age. Hand her over to the Inquisition, and the Council may spare your crown." A low, vibrating growl began to resonate in Cedric's chest, a sound so primal and terrifying that the torches lining the walls seemed to flicker and dim. "You speak of my territory, my laws, and my people as if you have authority here, Cromwell." "We have the authority of the United Pax," Cromwell shouted, his face reddening. "Defy us, and 50,000 wolves will march on Dunbarton. We will leave no stone unturned, no throat uncut. Produce the Omega or face annihilation." The great hall fell dead, silent. The threat of 50,000 warriors was not an idle boast. It was an army that could wipe the Iron Fang pack from the face of the earth. But Cedric did not flinch. Instead, a slow, dangerous smirk spread across his scarred face. "Produce the Omega," Cedric echoed softly. He raised his right hand, snapping his fingers once. From the shadowed archway behind the throne, a figure emerged. The entire hall collectively held its breath. Genevieve walked into the light, dressed not in the ragged, blood-stained clothes of a banished outcast, but in the magnificent, rich crimson and black silks of the Iron Fang pack. A heavy cloak of dire wolf pelt was draped over her shoulders, fastened by a solid gold brooch bearing Cedric's royal crest. She looked ethereal, radiant, and undeniably powerful. In her arms, she held a thick, velvet swaddle. Cromwell sneered, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of genuine shock at her otherworldly beauty. "Arrest her," he commanded the paladin standing near the doors. "Take one step toward my queen, and I will sever your head from your shoulders," Cedric roared, surging to his feet, the sheer, explosive force of his alpha command slammed into the room, forcing the council paladins to instinctively stagger backward. "Queen?" Rothcroft gasped, his face twisting in disgust. "You would mate a witch? You would corrupt the royal bloodline?" "I would elevate it," Cedric snarled. He descended the steps of the dais, moving to stand protectively at Genevieve's side. He placed a massive, possessive hand on the small of her back. "Genevieve is under my absolute protection. The Pups are my heirs. Any man who questions this claims an enemy in me." Inquisitor Rothcroft's eyes narrowed viciously. He pulled a heavy silver-laced amulet from beneath his robes, an ancient artifact designed to suppress and burn arcane energy. "She has blinded you with her hexes. I will purge this hall of her taint myself." He raised the amulet, chanting a harsh, guttural incantation in the old tongue. The silver began to glow with a blinding, searing heat, emitting a high-pitched frequency that made the dire wolves in the room bare their teeth in agony. Genevieve stumbled slightly, her violet eyes widening in pain as the oppressive magic of the Inquisition artifact pressed against her mind. But then, the velvet swaddle in her arms shifted. Aurelia, the sixth pup, poked her tiny head out from the blankets. She let out a tiny, high-pitched yip that completely cut through the ringing frequency of the amulet. Suddenly, the pup's eyes snapped open, blazing with that impossible, radiant silver light. The air in the great hall instantly plummeted below freezing. A shockwave of pure, unadulterated lunar energy blasted outward from the tiny pup. Frost exploded across the stone floors, racing up the walls and shattering the stained glass windows. The silver amulet in Rothcroft's hand violently cracked, turning black before exploding into a cloud of useless dust. The Inquisitor screamed, falling to his knees as the backlash of ancient magic burned his palms. Cromwell stumbled backward, his face entirely devoid of color, his jaw slacked in absolute horror. He stared at the tiny white pup in the Omega's arms, realizing with crushing certainty that the ancient prophecies were not just stories to frighten pups. Cedric drew his broadsword, the steel ringing out in the frozen silence of the hall. He pointed the blade at Cromwell's throat. "Tell the High Council," Cedric whispered, his voice echoing like the god of winter himself, "that the Iron Fang pack does not bow. Tell them the oracle has returned. And if they send an army to my gates, I will paint the Whitner Mountains red with their blood. Get out of my castle." The terrified retreat of Lord Harrison Cromwell and his crippled paladins marked the beginning of the most documented and devastating lycanthrope war in medieval history. According to the controversial Fitzroy manuscripts, a series of 14th-century leather-bound journals currently sealed within the restricted vaults of the British Museum, donated by the private estate of Lord Henry Cavendish in 1892. The events that followed forever altered the biological and political landscape of the world. The High Council of Alphas did not simply accept their humiliation. They rallied the united Southern, Eastern, and Western packs, amassing an unprecedented armada of 50,000 feral warriors. Their singular objective was the complete eradication of Castle Dunbarton, King Cedric Montgomery, and the Albino Omega, who threatened their patriarchal dominance. For 3 grueling months, the Iron Fang pack fortified their stronghold. The Whitner Mountains became a lethal labyrinth of traps, trenches, and spiked barricades. Yet, within the cold, heavily armed walls of the fortress, a profound transformation was taking place. Genevieve Sinclair was no longer the frail, broken creature Cedric had pulled from the freezing snow. Nourished by the unyielding protection of the Alpha King and the innate, awakening magic of her bloodline, she flourished into a fiercely radiant queen. Her 6 pups grew at an astonishing, supernatural rate, with Aurelia, the silver-eyed oracle, demonstrating terrifying displays of telekinesis and elemental control that baffled even the oldest castle scholars. On the eve of the winter solstice, exactly 1 year after Genevieve's rescue, the Council's massive army finally breached the lower mountain passes. The ground shook violently as tens of thousands of armored dire wolves marched upon Dunbarton, their torches painting the night sky in the horrifying hues of a raging inferno. Cedric stood upon the highest battlements, his heavy black iron armor gleaming under the pale moonlight. He watched the endless sea of enemies approaching his gates, his jaw set, his crimson eyes burning with a monstrous resolve. He knew the tactical reality. His 3,000 vanguard warriors were elite, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. They would drown in the sheer tide of council soldiers. "You should be in the crypts with the pups," Cedric rumbled as he heard the soft, familiar rustle of silk behind him. Genevieve stepped up to the stone parapet, wrapping her arms around Cedric's massive waist, pressing her face against the cold steel of his backplate. "I will not hide in the dark while my mate bleeds for me," she whispered, her voice steady and echoing with a strange, harmonic resonance. Cedric turned, his fierce expression softening instantly as he looked down at her. "Genevieve, if the gates fall, they will not fall," she interrupted, looking up at him with blazing violet eyes. "The Fitzroy journals speak of the oracle's blessing, Cedric, a raw, ancient magic that can only be unlocked when the blood of the moon fully binds with the blood of a true alpha. Reginald Beaufort never completed the mating bond with me out of disgust. But you have given me everything. You gave me my life, my children, and your heart." Before Cedric could protest, Genevieve reached up, her pale hands framing his battle-scarred face. She pulled him down, capturing his lips in a desperately passionate, soul-searing kiss. As their lips met, she bit down sharply on his lower lip, drawing a single drop of alpha blood. At the exact same moment, she pressed her wrist against his fangs. Cedric's primal instincts surged, and he instinctively claimed his mate, his fangs sinking gently into her pale flesh to complete the sacred, unbreakable bond. The reaction was instantaneous and cataclysmic. A blinding, explosive shock wave of silver and crimson energy erupted from their bodies, shattering the stone parapets around them. Cedric threw his head back and unleashed a roar that defied the laws of nature. The sound was so impossibly loud, so saturated with ancient, divine dominance, that it echoed across the entire mountain range. The advancing army of 50,000 wolves suddenly halted in their tracks, their internal beasts paralyzed by a wave of pure, subjugating terror. Cedric looked down at his hands. The crimson light of his alpha aura had fused with the glowing, ethereal silver of the lunar oracle. He was no longer just a king. He was a god of war infused with the raw power of the cosmos. "Open the gates!" Cedric's magically amplified voice thundered across the valley. The massive iron portcullis shrieked as it was raised. Cedric did not wait for his vanguard. He shifted mid-stride, transforming into a colossal, monstrous dire wolf the size of a warhorse. His fur was pitch black, but his eyes and the arcane runes now burning across his hide glowed with blinding silver light. He collided with the council's front lines like a falling meteor. The battle was not a siege. It was an absolute massacre. Armed with the oracle's blessing, Cedric moved faster than the eye could track, tearing through armored paladins as if they were made of parchment. His vanguard, emboldened by their king's godlike power, charged into the fray, their own strength miraculously amplified by Genevieve's magic, radiating from the castle walls. High above the carnage, standing upon the balcony with Beatrice by her side, Genevieve held the tiny glowing form of Aurelia. The oracle pup looked up at the night sky and let out a piercing melodic howl. In direct response to the child's call, the full moon above violently shifted from pale white to a deep, terrifying blood red. Under the blood moon, the council's magic users were completely stripped of their powers. Lord Cromwell, witnessing the total decimation of his unstoppable army at the hands of a single glowing alpha, turned his mount to flee in absolute cowardice. He did not make it 10 yards. Cedric's massive jaws clamped down on the Prime Minister's armor, crushing it like a brittle shell, ending the tyranny of the High Council in one brutal, definitive snap. By dawn, the snow was stained red, but Castle Dunbarton stood unbreached. The surviving members of the Council's army surrendered, dropping to their bellies and exposing their throats in absolute submission to the new supreme monarch of the lycanthrope world. King Cedric Montgomery, the ruthless warlord who had waged war for an abandoned Omega, had not just saved her life. Together, they had shattered the old world and forged a new empire of equality, magic, and unbreakable loyalty. The Blood Moon Siege permanently dismantled the corrupt High Council, proving that the bond between a fiercely devoted Alpha and an empowered Omega could rewrite history. King Cedric and Queen Genevieve Montgomery ruled for over 8 decades of unprecedented peace, their legendary romance recorded in the secret archives of humanity forever. Their story teaches us that true strength is not found in cruelty, but in protecting the vulnerable and destroying those who prey upon them. If you were completely hooked by this epic werewolf drama, hit that like button, share this tale with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible hidden histories and mythical romances